They thought they sold me a useless piece of land for $2,900. Just a dry little patch behind a tennis court with an ugly concrete box sitting on it. What they didn't realize was that when I opened that box, I was looking straight at the lifeline of an entire neighborhood. And once I understood that, the power dynamic between me and 120 wealthy homeowners flipped overnight. My name's Daniel Carter. I'm an electrician from a small place outside Fort Collins, Colorado. Nothing fancy about my life. Gravel driveway, old Ford pickup with a cracked dash, coffee maker that's been running every morning since about 2009. Most days I'm up before sunrise, boots on the porch, tool bag over my shoulder, heading out to fix someone else's wiring problem. Electricians spend a lot of time looking at things other people ignore. Breaker panels, service lines, junction boxes. You start to notice patterns. You learn that every big, shiny system usually runs through some small forgotten piece of hardware somewhere. That habit of noticing things is the only reason this whole story happened. About 12 miles east of where I live, there's a place called Willow Creek Estates. One of those planned communities with matching roofs, trimmed lawns, and HOA rules thick enough to stop a bullet. Townhomes start around $800,000. Granite counters, smart thermostats, Tesla chargers in the garage. At night, the pool glows blue like a resort, and the streetlights are so clean you'd swear the neighborhood was built yesterday. Truth is, most of it went up around 2006 or 2007, which matters later. Now, the first time I heard about the property was through a guy named Leonard Grayson. Leonard used to be a real estate attorney back in Denver. Silver hair, pressed shirts, the kind of voice that sounds like it's always talking through a courtroom microphone, even when he's just ordering lunch. I'd met him a couple years earlier doing some electrical work at the Willow Creek Clubhouse. Leonard was on the HOA board back then, the guy who ran meetings, signed checks, made sure the rules got followed. And I'll be honest, he always talked to me like I was furniture. Not rude exactly. Just that polite tone people use when they assume you're not in the same league. Anyway, one afternoon, I get a call from him. "Daniel," he says, smooth and confident, "I might have a small opportunity you'd be interested in." Opportunity was a funny word for what he was about to show me. He asked if I could drive over to Willow Creek that evening. Said there was a tiny parcel behind the tennis courts the HOA wanted to unload. According to him, it had basically no value. Some leftover utility strip the developers never used. 20 by 30 feet. That's smaller than some people's living rooms. I figured maybe they needed someone local to hold it or something. Sometimes HOAs sell weird slivers of land just to clear paperwork. So after work, I drove over. The sun was just starting to dip when I pulled into Willow Creek. Perfect sidewalks, identical mailboxes, expensive SUVs parked like they were lined up for a brochure photo. Then I drove around the back of the tennis courts. And there it was. A sad little rectangle of cracked clay and dry grass. Maybe 600 square feet total. And sitting right in the middle was this beige concrete utility box about the size of a refrigerator, humming softly like it had a heartbeat. I walked around it once, then twice. You spend enough years around electrical equipment, you start recognizing that sound. Transformers hum a certain way. Leonard walked up beside me carrying a laminated folder. "Well," he said with a little chuckle, "not exactly prime real estate, huh?" He handed me a stack of documents already clipped together. Purchase agreement. Parcel map. Pre-signed HOA approval. Everything looked very tidy. Almost too tidy. "This land's basically scrap," he said. "We're just trying to clear it off the books. You'd own it outright. $2,900. I flipped through the papers slowly. Then I noticed a second document tucked behind the sale agreement. Utility easement. Meaning even if I bought the land, the HOA would still have legal rights to whatever equipment sat there. Leonard noticed me reading it and smiled. "Most people don't worry about that part," he said lightly. "It's just boilerplate." Now here's the thing. Whenever someone says most people don't read something, that's exactly when I start reading carefully. So I kept scanning. And the more I read, the more the whole situation started feeling strange. Because the easement was written in a way that looked rushed. Like someone had tried to patch a hole in paperwork after the fact. I looked up at the concrete box again. The hum inside it had that low, steady electrical vibration. Not a tiny connection. Something bigger. I handed the papers back. "I'm not signing the easement," I said. Leonard blinked. The polite smile stayed on his face, but his eyes tightened just a little. "Well," he said slowly, "that's kind of part of the deal. I'll still buy the land," I told him. "Just not the easement." For the first time since I'd known him. Leonard hesitated. Just a second. Then he laughed like it was nothing. Daniel, he said, that box barely does anything. It's just some leftover infrastructure from when the neighborhood was built. Then it shouldn't matter who owns the land, I replied. We stood there in the quiet for a moment. The tennis court's empty. Wind pushing dry grass along the dirt. Finally, he shrugged. If that's how you want to do it, he said. 3 days later, the deed was filed. $2,900. Cash. And that little patch of land behind the tennis courts officially became mine. The first thing I did the next morning was bring my tool bag and a flashlight. Because there's one rule electricians live by. If something's humming, you open the box and find out why. And the moment I lifted that heavy concrete lid, I realized Willow Creek Estates had made the biggest mistake of their lives. The lid on that concrete box weighed a good 100 pounds, maybe more. Took both hands and a bit of a grunt to slide it sideways. When it finally shifted open, the humming got louder, that deep electrical vibration you feel more in your chest than in your ears. I leaned over and shined my flashlight down inside. And right away, I knew something wasn't right. Because this wasn't some leftover piece of minor infrastructure like Leonard had suggested. Inside that box was a full utility junction setup, a transformer the size of a beer cooler, a water pressure regulator, and a panel of circuit breakers lined up like soldiers, each one carefully labeled with black marker. Pool, clubhouse, streetlights 1 to 3, streetlights 4 to 6. I just stood there staring for a second. Because when you've wired enough buildings, those labels mean something. That panel wasn't powering a tennis court light or a sprinkler pump. It was feeding half the neighborhood. I climbed down a little closer and ran the flashlight across the wiring. Thick feeder cables ran out through conduit pipes buried in the ground. Water lines too. Everything branching outward like veins from a heart. And suddenly the quiet little patch of dirt I'd just bought started looking a whole lot different. I remember leaning back against my truck and letting out a long breath. Okay, I muttered to myself. What exactly did you just buy, Danny? That night, I didn't sleep much. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee going cold beside it, pulling county records. Now county databases are a weird rabbit hole. Half the documents are scanned PDFs from 20 years ago, crooked pages, blurry stamps. But if you're patient, you can trace the history of almost anything. I searched the parcel number from the deed, then the surrounding lots, then the development permits from the original construction. Around midnight, I found something interesting. Willow Creek Estates had been built in 2007 by a company called Ridgeline Development. Big housing boom years. Everyone was throwing up subdivisions as fast as possible. And buried in the planning documents was a site plan showing underground utilities. Transformer node, water regulator, main distribution point, all located exactly where that concrete box was sitting. But when I checked the final filings, something was missing. There was no recorded easement tying that infrastructure to the HOA. None. Which meant something pretty wild. For 18 years, the entire neighborhood had been running their shared utilities through a piece of land that technically belonged to no one. And now, it belonged to me. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time. Not excited. Not angry. Just stunned. Because that kind of mistake doesn't happen often. Not in real estate law. Too many lawyers involved. Too many signatures. But every once in a while during the housing boom, developers rushed things. Paperwork got sloppy, and apparently Ridgeline had either forgotten to file the easement or assumed nobody would ever notice. The next morning I called a land surveyor. His name was Pete Alvarez. Good guy, about 60 years old, had surveyed half the county. We met out by the tennis courts 2 days later. Pete set up his tripod, checked coordinates, paced around with that laser measuring pole of his. Took about an hour. Finally, he walked over and tapped the concrete box with his boot. Well, he said, no question about it. Yeah, I asked. He grinned. This thing is sitting dead center on your parcel. That was the moment the situation became very real. Because if the equipment sat on my land, and there was no legal easement, then the HOA had exactly 2 options. They could negotiate, or they could try to move the infrastructure for an entire neighborhood. And moving that kind of system would cost millions. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Shaw, property attorney in Fort Collins, sharp as a razor blade. I explained everything. There was a long pause on the phone. Then she said, slowly, Daniel, you might have stumbled into something pretty significant. We met the next day. I brought photos from inside the utility box and copies of the county filings. Rebecca read through everything quietly, flipping pages, tapping a pen against the desk. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said, "this is fascinating. That good or bad?" I asked. "Oh, it's good," she said with a small smile. "For you." Then she explained the situation in plain terms. Without an easement, the HOA technically had no legal right to keep infrastructure on my land, meaning I could demand removal, or negotiate a lease, or sell them the parcel back, for whatever price both parties agreed to. I stared at her. "So you're telling me that little box powers the whole neighborhood?" "From what I can see," she said, "yes. And they sold it to me for $2,900. Rebecca laughed once, softly. "Looks that way." For a minute, neither of us said anything. Then she leaned forward and folded her hands. "The real question," she said, "is what you want to do about it." Now here's where people usually assume the story turns into some greedy revenge fantasy. But the truth is, my first instinct wasn't to squeeze them. It was confusion, because I kept thinking about Leonard. The man had been a real estate attorney. There was no way he didn't understand what that parcel was, which meant one of two things. Either he'd made a colossal oversight, or he'd been hoping I wouldn't look too closely. And that second possibility sat in my stomach like a stone. So we drafted a letter. Simple. Professional. Rebecca mailed it certified to the Willow Creek HOA board. It said the following. The utility infrastructure located on parcel 417B is currently situated on privately owned land without a recorded easement. Please remove all equipment within 30 days or contact us to negotiate lease terms. 3 days later, my phone rang. Leonard. His voice sounded different now. Tight. Controlled. "Daniel," he said, "we received your letter. I figured you would. You can't seriously be asking us to remove those systems." "I didn't ask," I replied calmly. "My lawyer did." Silence. Then he said, "Let's be reasonable about this." That word again. Reasonable. "Sure," I said. "We can negotiate." Another pause. "You're interfering with essential services for the community," he said. "There could be legal consequences." I leaned back in my chair. "Leonard," I said, "I bought a piece of land you offered for sale. Everything on it is now my property concern. That's how ownership works." His breathing got heavier on the other end. "You know this affects 120 families." "I know," I said quietly. "You probably should have checked the paperwork before selling it." He hung up after that. 7 days later, I installed an 8-foot steel fence around my parcel. Nothing aggressive, just a simple perimeter fence with a locked gate. And on that gate, I hung a small metal sign. Private property. Utility access available for lease. 2 days after the fence went up, Rebecca called me laughing. "You might want to sit down," she said. "Why?" "The HOA just had an emergency board meeting. And they're panicking. Apparently, once the homeowners realized their shared utilities sat on land they didn't own, things got heated. Because the entire neighborhood's electrical distribution, water pressure control, pool system, and street lighting ran through that box. Which meant technically, if access was ever restricted, the whole system could shut down. Now I never cut power, never touched a wire. But that fence, it made the situation very clear. And 10 days after my letter went out, Leonard Grayson showed up at my house. Not in the Tesla I'd seen him drive before. This time he was in a dusty old Honda sedan. He stood in my driveway, tie loosened, sweat on his forehead like he'd been having the worst week of his life. When I stepped outside, he tried to smile. "Daniel," he said, "we need to talk." I crossed my arms and leaned against the truck. I figured we might. He glanced at the gravel driveway, the old pickup, my work boots by the door. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked uncomfortable standing on my property. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "This situation has gotten out of hand." I nodded toward the road. "You want to walk?" We started down the shoulder together. He took a deep breath. "You've made your point," he said. "But this is affecting an entire community." I stopped and looked at him. "Leonard, you tried to sell me that land with an easement already signed." His jaw tightened. "That's standard practice." "No," I said calmly. "That's covering a mistake." Wind rustled through the cottonwoods along the ditch. He looked away. Then finally he said the words that confirmed everything. "You weren't supposed to check the records." I let out a slow breath. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I figured that out." When Leonard said that, "You weren't supposed to check the records," he looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. We stood there on the side of that quiet county road for a minute, trucks passing every now and then, wind pushing dust across the gravel shoulder. For years that man had run meetings, signed contracts, probably explained property law to half the people in Willow Creek Estates. And now the one thing he hadn't expected was the electrician reading the paperwork. Finally, he rubbed his forehead and said, almost under his breath, this was supposed to be a routine sale. Routine for who? I asked. He didn't answer that. Instead, he turned back toward me, voice shifting back into that lawyer tone, the one that sounded practiced and careful. Daniel, the community needs that infrastructure. We both know relocating it would be extremely expensive. Yeah, I said. Probably would. So let's find a reasonable solution. There was that word again. Reasonable. Except now it sounded less like advice and more like a request. All right, I said. You want reasonable? Let's talk numbers. His eyes narrowed slightly. You're asking for money. I'm asking for a solution, I said. One that acknowledges the position your HOA is in. He looked tired. Really tired. Like the past week had aged him 10 years. Fine, he said. I'll bring this to the board. And that's how I ended up sitting in a conference room at Willow Creek Estates 2 weeks later, across from 60 very uncomfortable homeowners. The room smelled like burnt coffee and anxiety. Long folding tables arranged in a square. People whispering to each other, some staring at me like I'd just shown up to steal their house keys. Rebecca sat beside me flipping through a thin folder of documents. Calm as ever. Across the room, Leonard stood near a whiteboard with the HOA board members. He looked smaller than I remembered. When the meeting started, he cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming on short notice, he said. As you know, we've discovered a complication regarding a parcel behind the tennis courts. Complication. That was one way to put it. Then he gestured toward me. Mr. Daniel Carter is the current owner of that parcel. A low murmur moved through the room. Some people looked curious. Others looked furious. One guy in a golf polo leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms like he was already preparing to argue. Leonard continued explaining the situation, carefully avoiding certain words like mistake or oversight. But once the homeowners realized what was actually happening, the room started buzzing. Wait, that box controls the pool pumps. What do you mean the land isn't ours? How did this even happen? I just sat there quietly. Finally, Leonard turned toward me. Mr. Carter has proposed terms for resolving the issue. Rebecca slid a sheet of paper across the table. My terms were pretty simple. First, the HOA would purchase the parcel back from me for $150,000. Second, they would pay $18,000 in back rent for the years their infrastructure had occupied the land without an easement. Third, I would receive a 5-year advisory position on the HOA board with veto authority over any future property or infrastructure decisions. And finally, the HOA would send a written apology to all 120 homeowners explaining exactly how the oversight had occurred. The room went silent when Leonard finished reading. Then the guy in the golf polo slammed his hand on the table. This is extortion. Rebecca didn't even look up from her notes. No, she said calmly. This is property law. Another homeowner leaned forward. You expect every family here to pay for this. Rebecca shrugged slightly. That's up to your HOA board. But relocating the infrastructure would cost significantly more. More murmuring. Someone pulled out a phone calculator. Another person whispered something about legal fees. Leonard just stood there quietly. The confidence he used to carry like a suit of armor, it was gone now. Finally, a woman near the front raised her hand. She looked like a retired teacher or something. Calm but firm. Let's be practical, she said. If we divide the total by 120 homes, what are we talking about? Rebecca answered. About $2,150 per household. A ripple moved through the room. People started doing the math in their heads. $2,000 wasn't nothing. But compared to the value of their homes, it wasn't exactly devastating either. The man in the golf polo opened his mouth again, but another homeowner cut him off. Look, she said, this was the HOA's mistake. We fix it and move on. Someone else nodded. Another voice agreed. Within a few minutes, the mood in the room shifted from outrage to reluctant acceptance. Then Leonard called for a vote. Every board member raised their hand. Unanimous. Just like that, the deal was done. 30 days later, a cashier's check cleared my bank account. $258,000. $150,000 for the land. $18,000 in back rent. And the rest covering legal and administrative costs. A week after that, The HOA mailed a letter to every home in Willow Creek Estates. It explained that during the original development in 2007, a parcel containing critical utility infrastructure had never been properly recorded with an easement. It explained that the oversight had been discovered after the parcel changed ownership. And it acknowledged, in very polite corporate language, that the situation had been resolved through negotiation. Leonard Grayson resigned from the HOA board the same morning those letters went out. I heard later he moved back to Denver. Never saw him again. As for me, life mostly went back to normal. I still wake up early. Still drive the same old pickup. Still spend most of my days crawling through crawl spaces and wiring breaker panels. But in my living room, there's a frame hanging on the wall. Inside that frame are two pieces of paper. The first is the deed for that little 20 by 30-foot parcel I bought for $2,900. The second is the HOA apology letter. I keep them side by side. Not because of the money. Honestly, the money helped, sure, paid off the truck, fixed a few things around the house. But that's not why I framed them. I keep them there as a reminder. Because the truth is, nobody in that whole situation thought the electrician would read the fine print. They saw the boots, the pickup, the gravel driveway, and they assumed I'd sign whatever they handed me. Turns out, sometimes the quiet guy who works with wires for a living is the one who notices where everything connects. And sometimes all it takes to change the balance of power is opening one little concrete box. Now here's the part I'm curious about. If you were in my position, would you have done the same thing? Would you have pushed the HOA for that deal? Or would you have sold the land back quietly and walked away? Because depending on who you ask, I'm either the guy who protected his property rights, or the guy who held an entire neighborhood hostage over a technical mistake. So I want to hear what you think. Was it fair? Or did I cross a line? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I've seen people argue both sides of this story for hours. And honestly, I'm still not sure everyone would make the same choice I did.